I never thought the most important Christmas gift I'd ever give would be invisible. But there I was, on Christmas Eve 2023, watching my family tear into their presents like wolves on fresh meat. And I realized something that would change everything. Only one person in that room cared about me more than my money. My name is Eleanor Whitman, and at 67, I've built what most people would call a successful life. But success, I've learned, comes with a price that goes far beyond the years of 18-hour workdays, the missed family dinners, and the relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition. The real cost of wealth, I discovered, is learning to distinguish between those who love you and those who love what you can provide for them. 43 years ago, I started Whitman & Associates from my kitchen table in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Queens. I had nothing but a second-hand typewriter, a phone book, and the absolute determination to prove that a woman could run a financial consulting firm just as well as any man. My then-husband David thought I was crazy. "Eleanor," he'd say, shaking his head while reading his morning paper, "you have 3 small children and no business experience. This is a fantasy." But David was wrong about many things, including his assumption that I'd give up when the going got tough. When clients hung up on me because they didn't want financial advice from a woman, I kept calling. When banks refused to give me a business loan because I didn't have a male cosigner, I found investors who believed in my vision. When David finally left me for his secretary in 1987, claiming that my obsession with work had destroyed our marriage, I used the anger and determination from that betrayal to fuel the most successful decade of my career. Today, Whitman & Associates manages over $200 million in assets. We have offices in Manhattan, Boston, and Miami. The lake house in Vermont where I spend my weekends? Mine. The penthouse overlooking Central Park where I host charity galas? Mine. The vacation home in the Hamptons where I used to take my children every summer? All mine. But success, I've learned, has a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention from the people who should love you unconditionally. The warning signs had been there for months, maybe even years, but I'd been too busy building my empire to notice how my children had changed. My eldest son, Richard, now 41 and working as a mid-level marketing executive, had been calling more frequently since his wife Lisa lost her job at the advertising agency. But these weren't the warm, checking-in calls I'd hoped for as he entered middle age. Instead, they were carefully orchestrated conversations that always seemed to circle back to my estate planning or pointed questions about my financial future. "Mom," he'd say during our Sunday phone calls, "have you thought about what happens to the business when you retire? I mean, you're not getting any younger, and it would be terrible if everything you've built just disappeared." The subtext was clear. He wanted to know what was coming to him, and when. My daughter Patricia, 38, and struggling with her own failing marriage to a contractor who drank too much and worked too little, had suddenly developed an intense interest in my health. She'd started scheduling doctor appointments that she insisted on attending, taking notes with the intensity of a court reporter documenting evidence for a lawsuit. She'd ask the doctors detailed questions about my prognosis, my mental acuity, my long-term outlook, always with this expression of exaggerated concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I just want to make sure you're taking care of yourself, Mom," she'd say. But I could see her calculating something behind those concerned glances. She'd started commenting on my memory whenever I forgot small details, making jokes about senior moments that felt less like humor and more like documentation. "Remember, Dr. Martinez," she'd said to my physician during my last annual checkup, "my mother sometimes gets confused about dates and appointments. We should probably discuss preparations." And my youngest, Michael, who'd just turned 35 and was drowning in student loan debt from a master's degree in film studies that hadn't led to the Hollywood career he'd imagined, had begun showing up at my house every weekend with his new girlfriend, Brittany. They'd arrive with a bottle of cheap wine and stay for dinner, and I'd catch them examining my antique furniture with the intensity of auction house appraisers. Michael would walk through my living room, casually touching my grandmother's china cabinet. running his fingers along the mahogany dining table where his grandfather had taught him to play chess, admiring the oil paintings I'd collected over the decades. "This stuff must be worth a fortune, Mom," he'd say, trying to sound casual. "Have you ever had it appraised? You know, for insurance purposes?" But it was my executive assistant, Sarah Chen, who had remained exactly the same throughout all of this family drama. For 12 years, she'd been the steady, unshakable presence in my chaotic business world, the one person who knew every detail of my professional life, every appointment, every financial decision, every family crisis that had required my attention or intervention. Sarah had started working for me when she was 26, fresh out of business school with a degree in organizational management and a quiet intensity that reminded me of myself at that age. She was the daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had arrived in California with nothing but hope and an unshakable work ethic. Her parents had worked 3 jobs each to put her through college, and she'd graduated with honors despite working 20 hours a week to help pay for her education. I'd hired her initially because she was the only candidate who hadn't asked about salary during the interview. Instead, she'd wanted to know about the company's mission, about my vision for growth, about what challenges she'd face and how she could contribute to solving them. Over the years, she'd proven herself to be not just efficient and reliable, but genuinely invested in the success of the business and, by extension, my success. She'd watched my children grow from ambitious young adults with bright futures into the people they'd become now, adults struggling with their own failures and increasingly focused on what they might inherit rather than what they might achieve on their own. And through all of it, through every family crisis and business triumph, Sarah had never once asked me about my will, my investments, or what would happen to my money when I was gone. She knew everything about my finances. She had access to my accounts, my investment portfolios, my real estate holdings. She knew exactly how much I was worth down to the last dollar, and she could have easily manipulated that information for her own benefit. Instead, she used her knowledge to help me make better decisions, to protect my interests, and to ensure that my business continued to thrive. When my children called the office, Sarah was always professional and courteous, but I'd noticed how her tone would shift slightly when they started asking questions about my schedule, my health, or my plans. She'd give them the information they needed, but nothing more, and I'd caught her more than once looking concerned after hanging up from conversations with them. That Christmas Eve of 2023, as I sat in my living room watching my family perform their annual ritual of gift-giving, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The gifts themselves were an afterthought, expensive but impersonal items that suggested they'd been purchased by assistants or grabbed hastily from high-end department stores. Richard gave me a cashmere scarf that still had the price tag attached. Patricia's gift was a coffee table book about Vermont that looked like it had been sitting in her car for weeks. Michael presented me with a bottle of wine that I recognized from my own collection. Apparently, he'd taken it from my cellar during one of his recent visits and regifted it to me. But it wasn't the thoughtless gifts that bothered me. It was the behavior that accompanied them. Richard kept checking his phone throughout the evening, and I could see him whispering to his wife Lisa about timelines and probate processes. At one point, I overheard him telling her, "The lawyers said it usually takes 6 to 8 months, depending on how complicated the estate is." Patricia was taking pictures of everything, not happy family photos, but detailed shots of the artwork on my walls, the jewelry I was wearing, even the vintage china we were using for dinner. She'd position herself to get clear images of my paintings, zooming in on signatures and making sure the lighting captured every detail. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off. "Just preserving memories, Mom. You know how much I love this house." And Michael, sweet Michael, who used to build snowmen with me in this very yard, spent the entire evening asking me about my legacy and whether I'd made provisions for my grandchildren's college funds. The grandchildren, I should mention, who existed only in his imagination since neither he nor his siblings had actually had children yet. "I've been thinking, Mom," he said over dessert, "about family legacy and making sure the Whitman name continues to mean something. Have you thought about setting up education trusts? For the future? They thought they were being subtle. They thought I didn't notice. But I'd spent 4 decades reading people, understanding their motivations, seeing through their carefully constructed facades. These weren't my children anymore. They were investors, circling like vultures, waiting for their payout. The moment that broke my heart came during dessert, when Patricia was serving my famous chocolate cake. This was the recipe I taught her when she was 16, standing in this same kitchen, flour on both our aprons as we laughed about some boy she had a crush on. Those Sunday afternoons baking together had been some of our best times, when she was still young enough to want my advice, and I was still naive enough to believe that our closeness would last forever. As she cut the cake, Patricia casually mentioned that she'd been talking to a financial advisor about inheritance tax strategies. She said it as if she were discussing the weather, but I could see the calculation in her eyes, the way she was watching my reaction. Richard, not to be outdone, immediately jumped in with his own research about estate maximization and how important it was to plan ahead for the family's financial security. He pulled out his phone and started showing me articles he'd saved about tax shelters and trust funds, speaking with the authority of someone who'd been researching my death like a business opportunity. Michael, clearly feeling left out of the conversation, started discussing family trusts and asset protection strategies that he'd been researching online. He had charts, actual printed charts, showing different scenarios for how my wealth could be distributed to minimize taxes and maximize their inheritance. I sat there listening to them discuss my death like it was a quarterly earnings report, and I felt something inside me crystallize. This wasn't grief, it was clarity. These people didn't love Eleanor Whitman. They loved Eleanor Whitman's bank account. They had turned my dining room into a boardroom, my family dinner into a succession planning meeting. They were discussing my funeral expenses as if they were marketing costs, debating the merits of cremation versus burial based on which option would leave more money for them to inherit. That's when Sarah, who'd been quietly helping serve dinner, as she always did during family gatherings, appeared at my elbow with a fresh cup of tea. She'd been coming to my family Christmas dinners for the past 5 years, initially because she had no family of her own in New York, and I couldn't bear the thought of her spending the holiday alone. Over time, her presence had become not just welcome, but essential. She was often the only person in the room who seemed genuinely happy to be there. "Mrs. Whitman," she said softly, her voice a gentle contrast to the harsh financial planning discussion still happening around the table. "Would you like me to start clearing the dessert plates, or would you prefer to sit with your family a bit longer?" The simplicity of her question, the genuine concern in her voice, the fact that she was thinking about my comfort rather than my assets, it was like a light being switched on in a dark room. Here was someone who had access to every aspect of my financial life, who knew exactly how much I was worth, who could have easily manipulated me or played on my emotions for personal gain. Instead, she was asking if I wanted to sit with my family a bit longer. The irony wasn't lost on me. The person who had the most access to my wealth was the only one who wasn't calculating how to get more of it. I looked around the table at my 3 children, who had stopped their inheritance planning conversation just long enough to notice Sarah's presence. Patricia actually rolled her eyes, as if Sarah's courtesy was an interruption to their important financial discussion. Richard checked his phone again, probably calculating how much money he was losing by having to sit through family dinner instead of working on his side business. Michael was already reaching for his coat, ready to leave now that the meal was over and he'd gathered the information he'd come for. "Sarah," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "thank you for asking, but I think we're done here." The silence that followed was telling. My children exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that their mother might have been paying closer attention to their conversation than they'd assumed. But instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, they looked annoyed, as if I'd interrupted something important. Richard was the first to recover. "Mom, we were just trying to help you plan for the future. These are important conversations to have." "Important for whom?" I asked quietly. Patricia jumped in, her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. "Mom, we're your children. We love you, and we want to make sure you're prepared for whatever happens. Is that so wrong?" "No," I said, standing up from the table. "What's wrong is that you're more prepared for my death than you are for my life." They left shortly after that, gathering their expensive coats and their printed charts, kissing my cheek with the same perfunctory affection they'd show to a business associate. They promised to call soon, to visit more often, to continue the conversation about my financial planning. But I could see in their eyes that they were already calculating, already planning, already dividing up assets that weren't even available yet. Sarah stayed to help clean up, as she always did. We moved around the kitchen in comfortable silence, washing dishes and putting away leftovers, two people who had found in each other something that felt more like family than anything I'd experienced with my actual relatives in years. "Mrs. Whitman," she said as we finished wiping down the counters, "are you okay?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been missing for years. Sarah Chen wasn't just my employee. She wasn't just someone who helped me organize my schedule and manage my correspondence. She was someone who genuinely cared about my well-being, who noticed when I was upset, who stayed late not because she was paid to, but because she wanted to make sure I was all right. "You know what, Sarah?" I said, hanging up the dish towel and turning to face her fully. "I think I'm better than okay. I think I'm finally seeing clearly." The next morning, Christmas Day, I did something I'd never done before. Instead of hosting my traditional family brunch, a lavish affair that usually involved my children showing up hungover and distracted, eating expensive food while checking their phones and making half-hearted conversation, I called Sarah and asked if she'd like to join me for a quiet morning at the lake house. She seemed surprised by the invitation. "Mrs. Whitman, are you sure? It's Christmas. Don't you want to spend it with your family?" "Sarah," I said, "I am planning to spend it with family." We drove up to Vermont in comfortable silence, the winter landscape stretching out around us like a Christmas card painted in shades of white and gray. The lake house had always been my sanctuary, the place where I went to think, to plan, to remember who I was before the business consumed everything. I'd bought it 15 years earlier, when Whitman and Associates first started turning serious profits, and I'd spent countless weekends there, walking the trails around the lake, sitting by the fireplace with a book, planning the next phase of my company's growth. As we pulled into the circular driveway, I saw the property through Sarah's eyes, the wraparound porch that I'd had custom built to take advantage of the lake views, the massive stone fireplace that dominated the great room, the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the frozen water like something from an architectural magazine. "Mrs. Whitman," she said quietly, her breath visible in the cold air as we got out of the car. "This is beautiful. Thank you for bringing me here." We spent the morning by the fireplace, drinking coffee from my favorite ceramic mugs and talking about everything except business. For the first time in 12 years of working together, we had a conversation that wasn't about appointments or deadlines or client meetings. Instead, I learned things about Sarah that I should have known years earlier. She'd been born in San Jose to parents who'd immigrated from Taiwan in the early 1970s with nothing but hope and an unshakable belief in the American dream. Her father, David Chen, had worked as a janitor at a tech company during the day and driven a taxi at night, while her mother, Lily, cleaned office buildings and took in sewing to help pay the bills. They'd lived in a one-bedroom apartment for Sarah's entire childhood, sleeping on a fold-out couch so that she could have the bedroom for studying. "My parents sacrificed everything for my education," she told me, staring into the fire as if she could see her childhood playing out in the flames. "They never bought themselves anything new, never took vacations, never ate at restaurants. Every dollar they earned went toward my school supplies, my textbooks, my college applications." She'd chosen to become an executive assistant not because she lacked ambition, but because she genuinely enjoyed helping people organize their lives and achieve their goals. She'd had offers from larger companies, positions that would have paid more and offered better benefits. But she'd stayed with me because she believed in what we were building together. "I've always thought," she said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, that the most important gifts are the ones you can't put a price on. Time, attention, genuine care. My parents never had much money, but they gave me their presence. They showed up to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every graduation ceremony. That's worth more than any inheritance. As she spoke, I realized she was describing exactly what my own children had stopped giving me years ago. When was the last time Richard had called just to ask how I was feeling, without some underlying agenda? When had Patricia visited without bringing up my age, my health, or my plans? When had Michael shared anything real about his life, his hopes, his struggles, instead of treating our conversations like networking opportunities? I found myself telling Sarah things I'd never told anyone. About the loneliness of success, about the isolation that comes with wealth, about the constant wondering whether people loved you or loved what you could give them. I told her about the early days of building the business, about the nights I'd stayed awake worrying about payroll, about the satisfaction of landing my first major client and knowing that I'd built something real and lasting. She listened without judgment, without trying to fix anything, without offering platitudes or empty reassurances. She simply gave me what I'd been craving for years. Her genuine attention, her authentic presence, her unconditional care. "You know," I said as we sat watching the snow fall outside the windows, "I think this is the first Christmas in years where I've felt actually grateful instead of just going through the motions." "Why is that?" she asked. I looked at her. This woman who had become so much more than an employee without either of us really acknowledging it. And I realized something that would change everything. "Because," I said, "for the first time in years, I'm spending it with someone who actually wants to be here with me." That afternoon, as we walked around the frozen lake, our boots crunching on the snow-covered path that circled the water, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to rewrite my will, not out of spite, not out of anger, but out of a sudden, crystal-clear understanding of what actually mattered. I'd built my fortune through careful planning, strategic thinking, and the ability to see opportunities that others missed. Now I was going to apply those same skills to the most important decision of my life. Who deserved to inherit what I'd spent 4 decades building? The legal work took 3 months. I worked with Morrison, Kelly & Associates, a firm that specialized in estate planning and had no connection to my family or my business. I wanted lawyers who had never met my children, who wouldn't be influenced by family history or emotional appeals, who would simply help me structure my estate according to my wishes. James Morrison, the senior partner, was a man in his 60s who had handled estates for some of the wealthiest families in New York. He didn't flinch when I told him what I wanted to do, but he did insist on multiple meetings to ensure that I understood the implications of my decisions. "Mrs. Whitman," he said during our second meeting, "I need to be clear about something. What you're proposing will almost certainly result in legal challenges from your children. Are you prepared for that?" "Mr. Morrison," I replied, "I've been preparing for challenges my entire life. This one doesn't scare me." I structured everything carefully, legally, with the kind of precision that had made me successful in the first place. My children would not be left with nothing. I'm not cruel, and despite their behavior, they were still my children. Each of them would receive a trust fund that would provide them with an annual income of $75,000, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to live extravagantly without working. The bulk of my estate, however, would go to someone who had already proven that money wasn't what motivated her kindness. Sarah would inherit the lake house, the place that had become the backdrop for our deepening friendship and the setting where I'd finally understood what family was supposed to feel like. She would also become the primary beneficiary of my personal accounts, the ones separate from the business, totaling just over $3 million. Most importantly, she would receive controlling interest in Whitman & Associates, the company I'd built from nothing. I'd spent months evaluating her capabilities, watching how she handled complex situations, observing her interactions with clients and vendors. She had the intelligence, the integrity, and the work ethic to run the business successfully. And unlike my children, She actually understood and respected what we did. But I wasn't done. I also decided to establish a joint account with Sarah, one that would give her immediate access to a substantial sum while I was still alive. I wanted to watch her face when she realized that someone valued her not for what she could do, but for who she was. I wanted to see how she'd handle sudden wealth, whether it would change her fundamental character or simply give her the security she deserved. The account started with $500,000, money I'd been setting aside for months, and I structured it so that both our names were on it with full access for both parties. Sarah could withdraw funds without my permission or even my knowledge, and I was curious to see what she'd do with that level of financial freedom. Aliás, estou curioso para saber de qual cidade e país você está acompanhando essa história. Escreva nos comentários. The revelation came in May, 6 months after that Christmas Eve dinner that had changed everything. I had invited Sarah to lunch at Café Luxembourg, a quiet French bistro where we'd started meeting monthly, not to discuss business, but simply to enjoy each other's company. Over the past months, she'd become more than an assistant. She'd become the daughter I'd always hoped for, the family member who called because she was worried about me, not because she wanted something from me. These lunches had become one of my favorite parts of each month. We'd sit at the same corner table, order the same dishes, she always got the salmon, I always got the chicken, and talk about everything from current events to childhood memories to our dreams for the future. She told me about the novel she was writing in her spare time, a story about 3 generations of immigrant women building lives in America. I told her about my secret desire to learn to paint, something I'd never had time for during the busy years of building my business. Sarah, I said, sliding an envelope across the white tablecloth, I have something for you. She looked confused, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Mrs. Whitman, my birthday isn't until August, and you already gave me that beautiful scarf for Christmas. This isn't a birthday gift, I said, watching her face carefully. This is something else entirely. Something that's been a long time coming. She set down her fork and wiped her hands on her napkin before reaching for the envelope. What is it? Open it and see. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and pulled out the bank statements and account information. The documents showed the joint account I'd established, with both our names listed as account holders and a current balance of $500,000. I don't understand, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears as she read through the papers. Mrs. Whitman, I can't accept this. This is too much. I work for you. I haven't done anything to deserve this. Sarah, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. You've done something my own children forgot how to do. You've loved me without conditions. You've been present in my life without expecting anything in return. You've given me your time, your attention, your genuine care. That's worth more than money. She started crying then, not the tears of someone who just received a financial windfall, but the tears of someone who just realized they were truly valued, truly seen, truly loved. Other diners glanced over at our table, but I didn't care. This was one of the most important moments of my life, and I wasn't going to let social conventions diminish it. I don't know what to say, she managed between tears. No one has ever. You don't have to say anything, I told her, squeezing her hand. Just keep being exactly who you are. That's all I've ever wanted from you. We sat there for a long time, holding hands across the table, while she processed what had just happened. The waiter, sensing the significance of the moment, discreetly refreshed our coffee and left us alone. Mrs. Whitman, she finally said, can I ask you something? Anything. Why me? Why now? I thought about her question carefully before answering. Because you're the only person in my life who has never asked me for anything. Because you show up not because you have to, but because you want to. Because when you look at me, you see Eleanor, not Eleanor's bank account. She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Your children. My children see me as an asset to be managed, I said. You see me as a person to be cared for. There's a difference. That summer, Sarah used some of the money to pay off her student loans, debts that had been hanging over her head for years, limiting her options and causing her stress that she'd never complained about, but that I could see in the tension around her eyes during particularly difficult financial months. She also put a down payment on a small house in Connecticut, not far from the lake house, a charming colonial with a garden where she could grow the vegetables and herbs she'd always wanted to cultivate. But she didn't quit her job, didn't change her lifestyle dramatically, didn't start treating me differently. She simply continued being the person she'd always been, the person who'd earned my trust and my love through 12 years of quiet consistency and unwavering integrity. If anything, she seemed more relaxed, more confident, freed from the financial pressures that had been constraining her choices. She started taking art classes on weekends, something she'd always wanted to do but couldn't afford. She began traveling occasionally, visiting places she'd only read about in books. But she always came back to work with renewed energy and enthusiasm, and she never let her personal pursuits interfere with her professional responsibilities. Meanwhile, my relationship with my children continued to deteriorate in ways that were both predictable and heartbreaking. Richard started pressuring me more aggressively to think about my legacy and consider the family's financial future. His calls became more frequent and more demanding, and he began showing up at my office unannounced, claiming he was in the neighborhood and wanted to check in. During one particularly uncomfortable visit, he actually brought a financial planner with him, a sharp-suited man named Bradley who specialized in family wealth transitions. They presented me with a detailed proposal for how my assets should be managed, complete with pie charts and projected returns and tax minimization strategies. "Mom," Richard said, spreading the documents across my desk like a sales presentation. "We've done extensive research into the best ways to preserve family wealth across generations. This isn't just about us, it's about the grandchildren, about making sure the Whitman name continues to mean something." I listened politely to their presentation, but all I could think about was how Richard had referred to potential grandchildren as if they were investment vehicles, and how he'd started calling it family wealth, as if he'd contributed anything to building it. Patricia's approach was different, but equally disturbing. She began bringing up my age more frequently, making comments about my memory and my decision-making abilities that felt less like concern and more like documentation for future legal proceedings. "Mom, you forgot that we'd planned to have lunch today," she'd say after I'd mix up our schedules. "That's the third time this month. Maybe we should talk to Dr. Martinez about your cognitive health." She started insisting on accompanying me to medical appointments, asking the doctors detailed questions about my mental acuity and long-term prognosis. During one visit, she actually asked Dr. Martinez to explain the legal requirements for determining mental competency, framing it as just wanting to understand the medical side of things. Michael, emboldened by his siblings' increasingly aggressive approaches, began showing up at my house with moving boxes, claiming he was helping me declutter, but actually cataloging my possessions and asking pointed questions about their value and provenance. "This painting is gorgeous, Mom," he'd say, examining the signature in the corner. "Do you remember where you bought it? Do you have any documentation about its authenticity? You know, for insurance purposes?" Each conversation, each visit, each phone call confirmed what I'd realized that Christmas Eve. They saw me as an asset to be managed, not a person to be loved. They were so focused on their future inheritance that they'd forgotten to appreciate their present mother. The contrast with Sarah became more stark with each passing month. While my children were calculating the value of my possessions and questioning my mental fitness, Sarah was asking about my happiness, my health, my dreams for the future. While they were researching inheritance laws and tax strategies, she was remembering my favorite flowers and surprising me with books by authors she thought I'd enjoy. In September, I decided it was time to tell Sarah about the will. We were at the lake house for our regular weekend retreat, sitting on the porch watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and orange, when I handed her another envelope, this one containing a copy of my complete estate planning documents. "Sarah," I said, "I need you to know something something important about your future and mine." She accepted the envelope with the same careful attention she brought to everything, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. "What is it, Mrs. Whitman?" "I've rewritten my will," I said simply. "I want you to read it, and then I want you to ask me any questions you have." She opened the envelope slowly, reading through the documents with the methodical thoroughness that made her so effective in her work. I watched her face as she processed the information, seeing the moment when she understood what the papers meant. "Mrs. Whitman," she said quietly, setting the documents down on the small table between our chairs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when I die, you'll inherit this house, the majority of my personal assets, and controlling interest in Whitman and Associates. You'll be able to run the company or sell it or do whatever you think is best. The choice will be yours." She sat in silence for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky as she processed what I'd told her. Finally, she turned to look at me directly. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "I didn't become your friend because I wanted your money. I became your friend because you're a remarkable woman who deserve to be valued for who you are, not what you own." "I know," I said. "That's exactly why you're getting everything." She stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the lake that would someday be hers. "Your children," she said after a moment, "they're going to be devastated. They're going to hate me." "My children," I replied, joining her at the railing, "stopped being my children the moment they started seeing me as their retirement plan. They made their choice, Sarah. I'm just making mine." We talked late into the night about the implications of my decision, about the legal challenges that would certainly come, about the changes it would bring to both our lives. Sarah was concerned about the family conflict, worried about the publicity that might result from a contested will, anxious about her ability to run a company she'd helped manage but never led. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to run Whitman and Associates," she said honestly. "I know the day-to-day operations, but making strategic decisions, leading the team, dealing with major clients, that's all you." "Sarah," I said, "I've been watching you for 12 years. You handle complex situations with grace and intelligence. You understand our clients' needs better than some of our senior consultants. You have the integrity and work ethic that this business requires. Most importantly, you care about doing the right thing, not just the profitable thing." "But what if I fail? What if I make decisions that hurt the business or the employees?" "Then you'll learn from those mistakes and do better next time," I said. That's what I did. That's what everyone who builds something meaningful does. The months that followed were peaceful in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Sarah and I settled into a routine that felt more like family than any holiday gathering with my actual children had felt in decades. We worked together during the week, collaborated on business decisions, and spent weekends at the lake house, walking the trails, reading by the fire, cooking elaborate meals that we'd eat while discussing everything from politics to philosophy to our favorite books. I began teaching her the strategic aspects of running the business, involving her in major client meetings, asking for her input on important decisions. She proved herself to be not just capable, but insightful, bringing fresh perspectives to challenges that I'd been handling the same way for years. Our clients noticed the changes too. Several commented on the improved atmosphere in the office, the seamless coordination between Sarah and me, the sense that our team was working together more effectively than ever before. "Eleanor," said Margaret Thompson, one of our longest-standing clients, during a quarterly review meeting, "I don't know what you've done differently, but your office feels more cohesive, more responsive. Sarah has always been wonderful, but lately she seems more confident, more involved in the strategic discussions. Whatever changes you've made, keep them." Meanwhile, my relationship with my children reached a new low. Richard had hired his own financial advisor to evaluate my assets and develop what he called a family wealth strategy. He presented me with a formal proposal for how I should restructure my estate, complete with detailed projections and legal recommendations. "Mom," he said during one particularly tense meeting in my office, "we've identified several inefficiencies in your current estate planning. By restructuring the trusts and reorganizing the asset distribution, we can save the family hundreds of thousands in taxes and ensure that your wealth is preserved for future generations. The way he said, "the family," made it clear that he wasn't including me in that calculation. To Richard, I was already dead. My wishes irrelevant, my money already his to manage more efficiently than I had during my lifetime. Patricia's behavior became even more disturbing. She started recording our conversations on her phone, claiming she wanted to preserve family memories, but actually documenting anything that might be used to question my mental competency later. She'd ask me leading questions about dates and names, trying to catch me in moments of confusion that could be presented as evidence of cognitive decline. "Mom, do you remember what we talked about last week?" she'd ask, her phone positioned prominently on the table between us. "You seemed a little confused about the timeline for Dad's death. It was 1998, not 1997, remember?" Michael's approach was more straightforward, but equally mercenary. He simply started taking things from my house during his visits, small items that he probably assumed I wouldn't miss or remember. A silver letter opener that had belonged to my mother. A first edition book from my collection. A small oil painting that hung in my guest bedroom. When I confronted him about the missing items, he claimed he was preserving family heirlooms and making sure they don't get lost or damaged. He'd actually prepared a detailed inventory of what he'd taken, as if documenting theft made it legal. "Mom, you have so much stuff and you're getting older," he said, with the patronizing tone people use when they're explaining something to a child. "I'm just making sure these important family pieces are safe. You'll thank me later." The contrast between my children's behavior and Sarah's became more obvious with each passing day. While they were scheming and calculating and preparing for my death, she was helping me live. While they were questioning my judgment and documenting my mistakes, she was supporting my decisions and celebrating my successes. When I decided to expand the business into sustainable investing, responding to growing client interest in socially responsible financial planning, my children were skeptical and dismissive. Richard called it a risky trend that could damage our reputation with traditional clients. Patricia worried that environmental investing was too volatile and might hurt the long-term value of the company. Michael suggested I was being influenced by liberal propaganda and should stick to proven strategies. Sarah, on the other hand, threw herself into researching the sustainable investing market, identifying opportunities and developing strategies that would allow us to offer these services while maintaining our commitment to sound financial principles. She attended conferences, networked with other firms that had successfully made the transition, and developed a comprehensive business plan that impressed even our most conservative clients. "Mrs. Whitman," she said during one of our planning sessions, "I think this could be exactly what sets us apart from our competitors. Clients are looking for advisors who understand that financial success and social responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. We could be leaders in this space." Her enthusiasm and insight reminded me why I'd started the business in the first place, not just to make money, but to help people build financial security while supporting their values and goals. Sarah understood that in a way my children never had. The final revelation came at Christmas 2024, exactly 1 year after the dinner that had changed everything. I had invited my family for what I told them would be a special announcement regarding my estate planning. I also invited Sarah, as I had for every family gathering since the previous Christmas, but this time her presence felt different. She wasn't just the helpful assistant making sure everything ran smoothly. She was family. Richard, Patricia, and Michael arrived with their spouses, all of them clearly expecting good news about their inheritance. They'd been increasingly obvious about their expectations over the past months, dropping hints about estate planning and family financial security at every opportunity. Richard had even suggested that I hire a caterer for the dinner, claiming it would be more appropriate for such an important family meeting. I declined the caterer's suggestion and prepared the meal myself, with Sarah's help. We'd spent the afternoon cooking together in my kitchen, preparing the same menu I'd been making for Christmas dinners for 20 years. But this time, the cooking felt celebratory rather than obligatory, joyful rather than stressful. "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked as we put the final touches on the dessert. "No," I said, surprised to realize it was true. "I'm excited. For the first time in years, I'm looking forward to a family dinner." After dinner, I stood up and cleared my throat, looking around the table at the faces gathered there. My 3 children and their spouses sat expectantly, barely containing their excitement. Sarah sat quietly at the far end of the table, her expression calm but concerned. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight," I began. "As you know, I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past year about my legacy, my values, and what I want to leave behind when I'm gone." I could see the anticipation in my children's faces, the barely contained excitement. They thought this was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment I'd finally discuss how they'd be rewarded for their patience and their strategic positioning. "Last Christmas," I continued, "I had a realization about what truly matters in life. I realized that the most valuable gifts aren't the ones you can buy. They're the ones you earn through love, loyalty, and genuine care." I paused, looking around the room at my children's eager faces and Sarah's increasingly worried expression. "I've spent the past year carefully considering how to distribute my assets when I'm gone. I want to ensure that my wealth goes to someone who values me for who I am, not what I have." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Mom, we've been hoping you'd finally—" "I'm not finished," I said firmly, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed over 4 decades of running board meetings and managing difficult clients. The room fell silent. "I've rewritten my will," I said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Each of you will receive a trust fund that will provide you with a comfortable annual income for the rest of your lives. However, the bulk of my estate, including this house, the lake house, and controlling interest in Whitman and Associates, will go to someone who has proven that money isn't what motivates their kindness." I turned to Sarah, who was looking at me with a mixture of gratitude and deep concern, knowing what was coming next and understanding the implications for everyone in the room. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady and clear, "everything I've built will be yours. You've earned it through 12 years of genuine care, loyalty, and love. You've shown me what family is supposed to feel like." The silence that followed was deafening. It stretched on for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, a complete absence of sound that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Richard's face went white, then red, his mouth opening and closing as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find words. Patricia's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching rage. Michael looked like he'd been physically slapped, his head jerking back as if recoiling from a blow. "You can't be serious," Patricia finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's an employee, Mom. She works for you. We're your children." "You stopped being my children," I replied calmly, "the moment you started treating me like a business investment. Sarah became my family the moment she started caring about my happiness more than my bank account." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a harsh sound that made everyone wince. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "We'll contest this. We'll fight it in court. You can't just give away our inheritance to some stranger." "Your inheritance?" I asked quietly. "Richard, what did you do to earn an inheritance? When did you contribute to building this wealth? When did you show up for me without wanting something in return?" "She's not family," Patricia shouted, pointing at Sarah as if she were an intruder who had somehow snuck into our home. "She's nobody. She's just some assistant who manipulated you into thinking she cares about you." I felt anger rise in my chest, a protective fury I hadn't experienced since my children were small and someone had threatened to hurt them. But now they were the ones doing the threatening, and Sarah was the one who needed protection. "Sarah has never asked me for anything," I said, my voice cold. "She has never questioned my decisions, never pressured me about my finances, never made me feel like my only value was in what I could provide. Can any of you say the same?" Michael, who had been quiet until now, finally found his voice. "Mom, please," he said, and for a moment his tone reminded me of the little boy who used to climb into my lap when he was scared. "We love you. We're your family. This isn't right." "Michael," I said sadly, "when was the last time you called me just to ask how I was feeling? When was the last time any of you visited without wanting something? When was the last time you gave me your attention without calculating what it might be worth?" They couldn't answer because they knew I was right. They'd been so focused on their inheritance that they'd forgotten to inherit anything that actually mattered: my values, my work ethic, my capacity for genuine love. "You can try to contest the will," I continued, "but I've had the best estate lawyers in the country review every document. Everything is legal, everything is binding, and everything is final. I've been planning this for months, and I've made sure there are no loopholes, no technicalities, no grounds for legal challenge." Richard's face was now a deep red, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "This is about money, isn't it?" he said. "You think we only care about your money. But what about family loyalty? What about blood relations? What about everything we've been through together?" "What have we been through together, Richard?" I asked. "When was the last time you were there for me during a difficult time? When did you offer support that wasn't contingent on what you might get in return?" Patricia was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and frustration. "You're making a huge mistake," she said through her tears. "You're destroying this family for someone who doesn't even really know you. She sees you 8 hours a day at work. We're your children. We've known you our whole lives." "You've known the mother who provided for you," I corrected. "Sarah knows the woman I actually am." Michael made one final attempt, his voice taking on the pleading tone he'd used as a child when he wanted something he couldn't have. "Mom, what if we changed? What if we proved to you that we can be better? Give us another chance. Don't throw away our relationship for this." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing both the man he'd become and the boy he'd once been. "Michael," I said gently, "I gave you 35 years of chances. You had 35 years to show me that you valued me for something other than my ability to solve your problems and fund your lifestyle. Sarah showed me in 12 years what you couldn't show me in 3.5 decades. One by one, they left that night, gathering their expensive coats and their wounded pride, making threats about lawyers and legal challenges and family loyalty. Richard was the last to leave, stopping at the door to make one final statement. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice cold with fury. "When you're old and alone and she's spent all your money, you're going to realize what you've done to your real family." "Richard," I said, my hand on the doorframe as I prepared to close it behind him, "I'm already old, and until tonight I was alone. Now I have family again." After they left, Sarah and I cleaned up the dishes and put away the decorations in silence. We moved around the kitchen together, two people who had found in each other something that felt more authentic and meaningful than any blood relationship I'd experienced in years. "Are you okay?" she asked as we finished putting away the last of the china. "I'm more than okay," I said, hanging up the dish towel and turning to face her fully. "I'm free. For the first time in years, I'm surrounded by people who love me for who I am, not what I can give them." "Person," she corrected gently, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You're surrounded by one person who loves you for who you are." "Sometimes," I replied, "one person is enough. Sometimes one person is everything." The weeks that followed were difficult in some ways, but liberating in others. My children made good on their threats to contest the will, hiring an expensive law firm that specialized in estate litigation. They claimed that I lacked mental capacity, that Sarah had exercised undue influence, that the will was the product of manipulation and coercion. The legal proceedings were unpleasant, but not unexpected. James Morrison had prepared me for exactly this scenario, and we had documentation proving my mental competency, including recent evaluations from 3 different physicians. We had evidence of my decision-making process, including detailed notes from our meetings and correspondence that showed the careful thought I'd put into my estate planning. Most importantly, We had a paper trail showing my children's behavior over the past year. Their increasingly aggressive pursuit of information about my finances, their attempts to document my supposed cognitive decline, their efforts to position themselves as concerned family members while actually treating me like a financial asset to be managed. The depositions were particularly revealing. Under oath, my children were forced to admit how rarely they'd contacted me without some underlying financial motivation. They had to acknowledge that they'd never asked about my happiness, my health, or my emotional well-being, without connecting those inquiries to questions about my plans or my timeline. Richard was forced to admit that he'd hired a financial planner to evaluate my assets without my knowledge or permission. Patricia had to acknowledge that she'd been recording our conversations and asking my doctors about my mental competency. Michael had to confess that he'd been taking items from my house without permission. Meanwhile, the lawyers deposed Sarah extensively, looking for any evidence that she'd manipulated me or used her position for personal gain. What they found instead was 12 years of professional correspondence showing her consistent support for my decisions, her protection of my interests, and her respect for my autonomy. They found evidence of the many times she'd refused gifts I'd offered, the occasions when she'd talked me out of financial decisions that would have benefited her personally, the countless instances when she'd put my needs ahead of her own convenience or advantage. The case was settled out of court after 6 months, with the judge ruling that there was no evidence of mental incapacity or undue influence. My will was upheld in its entirety, and my children were ordered to pay their own legal costs as well as a portion of mine. But the real victory wasn't legal, it was personal. During those months of litigation, Sarah never once complained about the stress, the publicity, or the attacks on her character. She continued to support me, to work alongside me, to be the family I'd chosen rather than the family I'd been born into. Today, almost 2 years after that Christmas Eve revelation, Sarah and I continue to run Whitman and Associates together, but now as partners rather than employer and employee. She's proven herself to be not just a capable administrator, but a skilled leader and strategist. The company has grown under her increased involvement, and our clients have noticed the positive changes in our approach and our results. We've successfully launched our sustainable investing division, which has attracted new clients and generated significant returns. Sarah's vision for combining financial success with social responsibility has positioned us as leaders in a growing market, and other firms have started trying to poach our talent and copy our strategies. "Mrs. Whitman," Sarah said to me just last week as we reviewed our quarterly numbers, "I think it's time you started calling me Eleanor." "And I think," I replied, "it's time you started calling me Mom." My children have tried to reconcile, but their efforts feel hollow, motivated more by financial desperation than genuine remorse. Richard sent a long letter apologizing for his behavior, but it was filled with subtle hints about family unity and shared prosperity. He started a consulting business that's struggling, and I suspect he's hoping to repair our relationship as a path back to financial security. Patricia has attempted to rebuild our relationship through a series of lunch invitations and family photos, but she still can't help asking about my plans and my timeline. Her marriage finally ended in divorce, leaving her with significant legal bills and reduced income, and I can see her calculating whether playing the role of devoted daughter might improve her financial situation. Michael has been the most persistent, showing up at my office and my home with flowers and apologies, claiming he's learned from his mistakes and wants to rebuild our relationship. But I can see the calculation in his eyes, the constant assessment of whether his efforts are paying off. His girlfriend left him when it became clear that his expected inheritance wasn't materializing, and he's had to move back into a shared apartment with roommates. I don't hate them. I feel sorry for them. They've allowed greed to poison their capacity for genuine love, and they've lost something infinitely more valuable than money. They've lost their mother. But their loss has been Sarah's gain, and mine too. She's given me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to look forward to each day, a sense of family that's based on choice rather than obligation, love rather than expectation. She's taught me that family isn't about blood or shared history. It's about shared values, mutual respect, and unconditional love. She's shown me that the most important inheritance isn't money or property. It's the example of how to live with integrity, kindness, and genuine care for others. When I die, I know that my legacy will be in good hands. Sarah will use my resources not to enrich herself, but to continue the work I started, helping families plan for their futures, building wealth that lasts generations, and creating financial security for people who understand that money is a tool, not a destination. But more than that, she'll carry forward the lesson I learned too late to share with my own children. That the most valuable gifts are the ones you can't put a price on, and the richest inheritance is the knowledge that you were truly loved for who you are. The lake house where we spend our weekends is filled with laughter now, with genuine conversation and shared memories. We cook elaborate meals together, take long walks around the frozen lake in winter, and swim in the clear water during summer. We read books by the fireplace and discuss everything from philosophy to politics to our dreams for the future. Sarah has started painting, something she'd always wanted to try, and her canvases now hang throughout the house, landscapes of the lake in different seasons, portraits of the birds that visit our feeders, abstract pieces that capture the play of light on water. I've begun learning photography, finally having time to pursue the artistic interests I'd always pushed aside for business concerns. The business I built from nothing continues to thrive under her guidance and our shared leadership. We've hired additional staff, expanded into new markets, and developed innovative services that set us apart from our competitors. Our clients trust us, not just with their money, but with their dreams and fears and hopes for the future. And I, at 69, finally understand what it means to have a family that chooses you not for what you can provide, but for who you are. I understand the difference between being valued as an asset and being loved as a person. I understand that the greatest Christmas miracle isn't receiving something you want. It's recognizing who truly deserves what you have to give. Sometimes the daughter you always wanted isn't the one you gave birth to, but the one who chose to love you anyway. Sometimes the most important inheritance you can leave isn't money or property, but the example of how to recognize genuine love when you find it, and how to have the courage to choose it over obligation, expectation, or convention. As I write this, Sarah is in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly as she chops vegetables for the soup we'll share while watching the sunset over the lake. In a few hours, we'll sit by the fireplace, reading our books and discussing our plans for tomorrow, next week, next year. For the first time in decades, I'm not worried about being used, manipulated, or valued only for what I can provide. I'm simply enjoying the company of someone who loves me and whom I love in return, without conditions or calculations or hidden agendas. If you've enjoyed this story of unexpected family and true inheritance, please consider subscribing to hear more stories about the power of genuine relationships and the courage it takes to choose love over obligation. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that family is about so much more than blood relations, and that the most valuable gifts are often the ones that can't be wrapped, can't be bought, and can't be taken away. Remember that the people who truly love you will show up not because they have to, but because they want to. They'll value your happiness more than your assets, your well-being more than your wealth, your presence more than your presence. And when you find those people, hold on to them. Because they're the real inheritance, the true treasure, the Christmas miracle that lasts long after all the other gifts have been forgotten.